3 days after my daughter left me at a train terminal with a one-way ticket, I walked back into the house she thought she had already taken from me. She told me I was in the way. She believed that once I boarded that train, I would quietly disappear from her life and from the home my husband and I spent 30 years building. What she did not know was that I never boarded the train. Instead, I sat under the station cameras and waited. Because sometimes the moment someone tries to erase you becomes the moment the truth begins to surface. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hale, and I have lived most of my life in Charleston, South Carolina. I am 67 years old now, old enough to know that the quiet parts of life often carry the deepest meaning. For more than 30 years, a small two-story house on Harbor Street has been the center of everything I built with my late husband, Thomas. The house sits close enough to Charleston Harbor that I can see the water from the front porch. On most mornings, cargo ships move slowly across the horizon while the gulls circle overhead. It is a calm rhythm, the kind of rhythm that makes a person believe the world will continue the same way tomorrow. Thomas and I bought the house when our daughter Claire was still a little girl. At that time, the neighborhood was quieter, and the paint on the old homes looked worn from the salt air. We did not have much money then, but Thomas believed the house would grow with us. He was right about that. Every room inside it carries a memory. Claire learning to walk across the living room floor, school projects spread across the kitchen table, and long evenings when Thomas and I sat on the porch after work, listening to the harbor wind move through the trees. For 35 years, I taught history at a public high school not far from downtown Charleston. My days followed a steady routine of early mornings, lesson plans, and the quiet satisfaction of watching students discover stories from the past. Teaching gave me patience and a certain habit of looking carefully at how events unfold. History, after all, is rarely about one moment. It is about the slow chain of decisions that lead people somewhere they never expected to go. 5 years ago, Thomas passed away after a sudden illness. The house became quieter after that. I learned how silence can fill the same space that laughter once did. Still, the house never felt empty. It held too many years of our lives for that. Every photograph on the hallway wall reminded me that this place was more than property. It was the last piece of the life Thomas and I built together. Our daughter Claire is 39 now. She lives across town with her husband, Daniel Whitman. Claire works in real estate, a profession that suits her ambition and confidence. Even when she was young, she had a sharp sense for opportunity. She believed strongly that success came from moving forward quickly and taking chances when others hesitated. Daniel entered the picture several years ago when he began investing in property developments around the region. At first, his projects seemed promising, and Claire spoke about them with excitement whenever she visited. Over time, however, the tone of those conversations changed. Market conditions shifted, investment slowed, and Daniel began carrying more financial pressure than anyone expected. I noticed the difference gradually. Claire started taking phone calls during family dinners. She checked financial reports while sitting at the kitchen table where she once did homework as a child. There was always a sense that something urgent followed her into the room. 2 years ago, I had surgery on my hip after slipping on the front steps during a rainy afternoon. During my recovery, Claire helped manage some of my bills and paperwork. I trusted her completely, so giving her temporary financial authority seemed natural at the time. The arrangement was simple and meant only to make things easier while I healed. Charleston itself has always moved at a slower pace than the world Claire lives in. The old streets, the harbor wind, and the quiet mornings on Harbor Street create a kind of steadiness that I have always valued. I believe the future of this house was simple. One day, it would belong to Claire, just as naturally as seasons change. At least that was what I believed then. Looking back now, I can see the first signs that something had already begun shifting. Claire started visiting more often during those weeks. Each conversation slowly returned to the same subject, the same careful question about the value of the house and the land beneath it. At the time, I thought those questions came from curiosity. I did not yet understand they were the beginning of a plan. If you're still watching and this story has already caught your attention, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me. Because what happened next at that kitchen table would reveal the first crack in a relationship that had lasted a lifetime. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. In the weeks after my hip began healing, Claire started visiting more often than usual. At first, I believed it was simply the kindness of a daughter checking on her mother. She would arrive in the late afternoon carrying groceries or a bag from the pharmacy, sometimes bringing fresh bread from a bakery near her office. I appreciated the company. Since Thomas passed away, the quiet in the house had grown heavier in the evenings, and Claire's presence brought back a small piece of the old family rhythm. During those visits, she often walked slowly through the rooms, looking around with a careful eye. At first, I thought she was simply remembering the house the way it once was when she was young. She would pause beside the window in the living room that overlooked the harbor, or stand near the staircase where childhood photographs still hung on the wall. Her attention seemed thoughtful, but after a while, I noticed something different about the way she looked at things. Claire began talking about property values in Charleston's historic district. She mentioned how quickly prices had risen in the past few years and how homes near the harbor were becoming increasingly rare. She explained how buyers from larger cities were searching for historic houses like mine, often paying more than anyone expected. At first, I assumed this was simply work talk. Real estate was Claire's profession, and conversations about houses followed her everywhere. Gradually, those remarks began appearing more often. Each visit seemed to circle back to the same subject: the location of the property, the age of the house, the size of the land behind it. I listened politely, but felt a quiet discomfort that I could not quite explain. Around the same time, Claire started mentioning Daniel's investment projects more frequently. Her husband had been involved in several property developments along the coast. In earlier months, she spoke about those projects with excitement and confidence. Recently, however, the tone of those conversations had changed. Certain projects had slowed, and loans connected to the developments were creating unexpected pressure. Claire spoke about these problems carefully, as if measuring my reaction before continuing. One evening, she arrived carrying a leather folder instead of groceries. The sun had already begun sinking behind the harbor, and the kitchen was filled with the warm light that often settles into the room at the end of the day. I poured tea while Claire sat down across from me at the same table where she once finished homework assignments during high school. Without much small talk, she opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. She explained that Daniel's financial situation had become serious. According to her, one quick decision could stabilize everything again. Selling the house, she suggested, would remove the pressure and allow their family to recover before things became worse. The words settled heavily in the room. To Claire, the house seemed like a financial solution waiting to be used. To me, it was the place where every chapter of my adult life had unfolded. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I picked up the first document and began reading. Years of teaching history had trained me to study written pages carefully. The language in front of me did not describe a simple property sale. It transferred full ownership of the house into Claire's name. I looked up slowly and saw impatience in her expression. She had expected a quick signature, not a careful review. I pushed the papers gently back across the table. I told her I could not sign them. Claire's patience disappeared almost instantly. She insisted that I did not understand the pressure she and Daniel were facing. She said I was refusing to see how serious their situation had become. Her voice hardened as she spoke, and the warmth of the visit disappeared from the room. For the first time, I saw frustration in her eyes instead of concern. She gathered the documents with sharp movements and closed the folder. Then she stood from the table and said something that stayed with me long after she left. She suggested that my attachment to the house was making life harder for everyone else. A moment later, the front door closed behind her. I remained at the kitchen table listening to the quiet return to the house. The rooms looked exactly the same as they had earlier that evening, yet something invisible had shifted between us. For the first time, I began to wonder whether the visits had never been about checking on me at all. If you're still here, and you can feel the tension building, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following the story. Because the next decision would take this situation far beyond a family disagreement. It would lead to a moment at a train terminal that changed everything. Let's move on to Chapter 3. After the conversation at the kitchen table, the house on Harbor Street grew quiet again. For several days, Claire did not visit, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I told myself she simply needed time to calm down after our disagreement. Families argue sometimes. Mothers and daughters have always found ways to say things they regret. I believed that after a few days, the tension would fade and life would return to its normal rhythm. Nearly a week later, Claire called early in the morning. Her voice sounded controlled and careful. She said she had been thinking about my recovery and wanted to show me a peaceful retirement community she had heard about. According to her, the place was quiet, surrounded by open countryside, and designed for older residents who wanted a simpler life. She described it as a place where I could rest, heal fully, and enjoy more comfort than living alone in a large house. The suggestion surprised me, but I did not refuse. Parents often want to believe their children still mean well, even after uncomfortable conversations. Claire said she would drive me there herself. She explained that we needed to leave early because the journey would take several hours. The morning air felt cool and damp when she arrived. Charleston was just beginning to wake as we pulled away from Harbor Street. The harbor wind carried the familiar smell of salt through the open car window. Normally, Claire filled drives with conversation about work or the city, but that morning she spoke very little. Her eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. When I asked small questions, her replies were brief and distracted. The quiet inside the car stretched for miles as we traveled south toward Savannah, Georgia. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. The road passed through long stretches of trees and open marshland, and the silence between us made the distance feel even longer. When we reached the Savannah Amtrak terminal, Claire parked near the entrance and turned off the engine. She reached into the back seat and handed me a small cloth bag and a bottle of water. Then she placed a train ticket in my hand. I looked down at the ticket carefully. It was a one-way ticket traveling west to Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. There was no address printed on it, no information about a retirement community, and no contact name waiting at the destination. The paper felt thin between my fingers, already creasing where I held it. Claire watched my face closely. She said someone from the community would meet me once I arrived. The explanation sounded practiced, as if she had repeated it to herself before speaking. Before I stepped out of the car, Claire reached her hand toward me and asked for my mobile telephone. She said the phone barely worked and it would be easier for the staff at the community to contact her directly once I arrived. I hesitated for a moment before handing it to her. Claire removed the small card from the phone and dropped it into a trash container beside the curb outside the terminal. I noticed the deliberate way she waited a second to make sure the card disappeared into the bin. She closed the car door gently, gave a brief wave, and drove away. Inside the terminal, travelers moved through the waiting area with bags and tickets in their hands. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fuel. I carried the cloth bag and sat down on a bench near the center of the station. For several minutes, I watched the entrance doors, half expecting Claire to return because she had forgotten something. But she did not return. Slowly, the realization settled over me that she expected me to board that train and disappear quietly from Charleston. I remembered something my lawyer, Eleanor Briggs, once told me during a conversation about legal precautions. She said that if a situation ever felt wrong, the most important thing was to pay attention to small details. I looked around the terminal and noticed the security cameras mounted high on the walls and ceiling. Instead of walking toward the train platform, I remained seated on the bench where those cameras could clearly see me. I held the ticket in my hands and watched people pass by. For the first time, I began to understand that patience might matter more than panic. If you're still watching and wondering what happens next, comment number 3 below so I know you're with me. Because sitting under those station cameras was only the beginning of what would soon become a carefully documented truth. Now, let's move forward to Chapter 4. I remained seated on the bench long after the train that carried my name on its passenger list had departed. The station gradually settled into a steady rhythm of movement and sound. Travelers rolled suitcases across the polished floor, announcements echoed from the overhead speakers, and the faint smell of coffee drifted from a small stand near the entrance. Life inside the terminal continued without noticing the quiet decision I had made not to board the train. From where I sat, I could see several security cameras mounted high along the walls and ceiling. They watched the waiting area without interruption, recording every person who passed beneath them. I remembered a conversation I once had with my lawyer, Eleanor Briggs, during the months when I was recovering from hip surgery. At that time, she had warned me that when questions about finances or property arise, the most important thing can be a clear and visible timeline. That memory returned to me with surprising clarity while I sat in the middle of the terminal. If Claire truly expected me to disappear quietly on that train, then remaining where everyone could see me might become the most important choice I made that day. Hours passed slowly. I watched families gather their luggage when their trains arrived. I watched passengers hurry toward the platforms with tickets held tightly in their hands. No one paid attention to the older woman sitting patiently on the bench near the center of the station. Waiting like that gives the mind time to wander. My thoughts returned again and again to the evening at the kitchen table when Claire tried to have me sign the documents transferring ownership of the house. At the time, the moment had felt uncomfortable, but not dangerous. Now, sitting inside the terminal with a one-way ticket in my pocket, the connection between those events became clearer. If I had boarded that train, I would have been hundreds of miles away by nightfall. The house on Harbor Street would have been empty. I stayed seated until nearly 3 hours had passed. Only then did I open the cloth bag Claire handed me that morning. Inside were the bottle of water and a few small personal items she had packed earlier. I searched through the lining of the bag carefully until my fingers found the hidden pocket I had sewn months before. Inside that pocket rested the small mobile telephone Eleanor had given me during one of our meetings in Charleston. She had told me to keep it somewhere private in case I ever needed help quickly without using my primary phone. I turned the device on and waited for the screen to light up. When Eleanor answered, I explained calmly that I was sitting inside the Savannah train terminal and that Claire had left me there with a one-way ticket. I also told her about the phone she had taken and the card she had thrown away beside the entrance. Eleanor's voice remained steady while she asked a few careful questions. She wanted to know whether cameras were visible in the station and whether I had stayed in the same place since Claire drove away. I confirmed both details. She told me to remain exactly where I was. After the call ended, I placed the phone back into the pocket of the bag and continued waiting. For the first time since Claire left the parking lot, I felt a small sense of relief. Someone understood what was happening, and that knowledge brought a quiet steadiness to my thoughts. Late in the afternoon, I noticed Eleanor entering the station through the main doors. She moved quickly across the floor, carrying a folder under her arm and scanning the room until her eyes found me sitting on the bench. She approached without hesitation. Her expression told me she already understood far more about the situation than I had explained on the phone. She simply said that it was time for us to leave together. I stood from the bench and followed her toward the exit, holding the unused train ticket in my hand. If you're still here and curious about how this situation unfolds, comment number 4 below to show you're still following along. Because while one side believed the plan had already worked, something very different was beginning to happen behind the scenes. Let's continue with Chapter 5. The drive back toward Charleston that evening was quieter than the one Claire and I had taken earlier that morning. Eleanor Briggs drove steadily along the darkening highway, while the lights of passing cars moved across the windshield like slow reflections. I held the unused train ticket in my hand, folding and unfolding the thin paper as the miles passed beneath us. Eleanor did not react with anger when I finished explaining what had happened at the terminal. Instead, she approached the situation with the calm focus of someone assembling a careful record. As we drove, she asked me to walk through the entire day again from the beginning. She wanted exact times, the moment Claire arrived at my house, the time we left Harbor Street, the moment she handed me the ticket, the moment she asked for my mobile telephone and removed the small card from inside it. Each detail mattered to her. She explained that situations like this are rarely decided by dramatic moments. They are decided by the small facts that show a clear sequence of actions. Before returning me home, Eleanor stopped briefly at her office in downtown Charleston. The building was quiet by the time we arrived. Inside her office, she turned on a desk lamp and opened several files connected to my finances and property ownership. I sat across from her desk while she reviewed the documents carefully. The temporary financial authority I had granted Claire during my recovery from hip surgery had strict limitations written into it. Eleanor confirmed that Claire had never been given legal permission to transfer ownership of my house. The documents allowed her to help with routine payments only during my recovery period. That authority was already close to expiring. Eleanor began making phone calls immediately. She contacted my bank and placed restrictions on every account connected to my name. She prepared formal papers, revoking the temporary authority Claire once held. Each document was printed, signed, and placed into a folder that grew thicker as the evening continued. She also explained that the security footage from the Savannah train terminal would provide a clear record showing that I had been left there with a one-way ticket and without a functioning phone. While Eleanor worked methodically through these steps, another scene was unfolding inside my house on Harbor Street. I later learned about that evening from information Eleanor gathered after the situation began unraveling. Claire and her husband Daniel Whitman were sitting at the kitchen table where we had argued only days earlier. They believed their plan had already succeeded. In their minds, I was already traveling west on a train heading toward Oklahoma City. With the house now empty, they believed the final step could begin. Claire opened a bottle of sparkling wine that had been waiting in the refrigerator for weeks. Daniel, who had carried the weight of failing investments for months, finally allowed himself to relax. The sale of the house would solve most of their financial problems. Claire opened her laptop and contacted a real estate agent she had spoken with earlier about listing the property. She began entering the details of the Harbor Street house into the agent's online system. The historic location, the size of the land, and the proximity to the harbor made it extremely valuable. Halfway through the process, she attempted to submit a small listing fee using one of the financial accounts she once accessed while helping with my bills. The payment was declined. At first, she assumed it was a temporary banking error. She tried again. The second attempt failed as well. Confused, she opened the banking application connected to my accounts. A notification appeared on the screen informing her that her access privileges had been removed. Daniel noticed the sudden tension in her face. Claire attempted to log in again. The same message appeared. Moments later, her phone rang. The caller identification displayed the real estate agent she had contacted earlier. During that call, Claire learned something she had not expected. My attorney had already contacted the real estate office. The message was simple. Claire Whitman did not have legal authority to sell the Harbor Street property. The victory she believed she had secured only hours earlier began collapsing in seconds. Daniel watched from across the table as Claire stared at the screen of her phone, realizing that something in her carefully planned arrangement had already gone wrong. The 3 days after the terminal passed slowly, but they were not empty days. Eleanor Briggs spent each hour assembling the quiet structure of a legal record that could not be easily challenged. While I remained mostly inside the house, she moved between offices, banks, and phone calls, gathering pieces of evidence that turned a painful experience into something precise and undeniable. She obtained the security footage from the Savannah train terminal. The cameras showed everything clearly. The arrival of Claire's car near the entrance, the moment she handed me the ticket, the moment she took my mobile telephone and removed the small card before dropping it into the trash container. The cameras also showed something just as important, the long stretch of time I remained sitting on the bench after she left. Eleanor also contacted the station office and spoke with an employee who remembered seeing me waiting in the terminal for most of the afternoon. My phone call to Eleanor from the small emergency telephone created another clear point in the timeline. Piece by piece, the day Claire thought she had erased became permanently documented. At the same time, Eleanor finalized the legal paperwork protecting my finances and property. The temporary authority Claire once held had already been revoked. My bank accounts were restricted from outside access. Eleanor also began updating my will and property documents so that future decisions about the house would no longer rest on assumptions I once made about inheritance. When those preparations were finished, Eleanor told me we were ready to return to Harbor Street. 3 days had passed since Claire left me at the terminal. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had when we arrived that afternoon. The old oak trees lined the street, their branches moving slowly in the harbor wind. For a moment, the normal appearance of everything felt almost strange, as if the world outside the house had no idea how much had changed inside it. Eleanor parked along the curb and turned off the engine. Through the front window, I could see movement inside the house. Claire was expecting someone that afternoon, most likely the real estate agent she had planned to meet before everything began to collapse. A second car arrived behind us. 2 witnesses stepped out quietly and waited near the sidewalk. Eleanor had arranged for them to observe the conversation so that nothing that followed would rely on memory alone. Before we walked toward the door, Eleanor told me she would begin the discussion herself. Claire opened the door before we had the chance to knock. At first, she smiled automatically, assuming the visitors were the people she had been waiting for. The expression disappeared the moment she saw me standing beside Eleanor. For a moment, no one spoke. Eleanor stepped forward calmly and explained that I had been unable to call because my phone had been taken from me at the train terminal. The reminder of that detail caused Claire's expression to tighten almost immediately. Inside the house, Eleanor placed a folder and a laptop on the living room table. The room was filled with memories from years of family life, yet the atmosphere felt unfamiliar now. She opened the laptop and began playing the footage from the terminal cameras. The screen showed Claire's car stopping near the entrance. It showed the moment she handed me the ticket. It showed her driving away. Claire tried to interrupt, but Eleanor continued explaining the legal consequences already set in motion. Claire's financial authority had been revoked. Her access to my accounts had been removed. She did not have permission to sell the Harbor Street property. I reached into my pocket and placed the folded train ticket on the table between us. Claire looked down at it for a long moment. Eleanor then placed one final document beside the ticket. It was a formal notice requiring Claire and Daniel to leave the house within 30 days. The room fell silent as Claire slowly began reading the page. If you've stayed with the story this far, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still here. Because what happened after that confrontation inside the house would reveal the real cost of the choices that had been made. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. Claire held the eviction notice in her hands longer than I expected. The paper seemed heavier than its thin pages should have been. I watched her eyes move slowly across the lines Eleanor had printed, reading the same sentences more than once, as if the meaning might change the second time. The room had grown very still. Daniel stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, his earlier confidence gone. Only a few days earlier, he had believed the sale of the house would solve everything that had gone wrong in his business ventures. Now, he watched silently as the solution he expected turned into a problem neither of them could control. Claire's first reaction was disbelief. She tried to explain that the situation had been more complicated than it appeared. The pressure from Daniel's failing investments had grown worse each month. Loans were due. Investors were losing patience. In her mind, selling the house had seemed like the fastest way to repair the damage. I listened without interrupting. Her words moved quickly, but the explanation did not change the reality that had already unfolded. Eleanor calmly explained the terms written in the notice. Claire and Daniel had 30 days to leave the property. The house on Harbor Street remained legally mine, and no sale could take place without my direct approval. As Eleanor spoke, I saw the moment Claire understood that the situation had moved beyond her control. The frustration in her expression slowly faded, replaced by something closer to fear. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked uncertain. Standing there in the living room felt strangely unreal to me. I could still picture Claire as a child running across the same wooden floor, laughing as she chased the family dog through the hallway. Now the conversation taking place in that same room involved legal notices and deadlines. The next 30 days passed quietly. Claire and Daniel began packing their belongings almost immediately. Boxes appeared in the hallway and along the staircase. Drawers opened and closed throughout the day. The house filled with the dull sounds of tape sealing cardboard and furniture being moved across the floor. We spoke very little during those weeks. I spent most of my time in the front rooms of the house while they organized their departure. Sometimes I could hear them talking quietly upstairs, their voices low and tense. Other times, the only sound was the echo of footsteps moving through rooms that once held family gatherings. When the final day arrived, a moving truck waited along the curb outside the house. Daniel loaded the last of the boxes, while Claire carried smaller items from the porch. I stood near the front door and watched as their car finally pulled away from Harbor Street. The departure was quieter than I imagined it would be. After the truck disappeared around the corner, I walked slowly back inside the house. Each room felt larger without the movement of people inside it. The silence returned, but it carried a different weight now. Later that evening, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The same table where Claire once tried to have me sign the documents transferring the house. I rested my hands on the surface of the wood and looked around the quiet room. Protecting myself had been necessary, but understanding that did not make the quiet feel any lighter. A few weeks after Claire and Daniel left, the house on Harbor Street began settling into a quieter rhythm. At first, the silence felt almost unfamiliar. For years, the rooms had carried the sound of daily routines, conversations, and the small movements that come from more than one person living under the same roof. Now, the quiet returned in long stretches that followed me from room to room. I spent those early weeks doing small things around the house. Some tasks were simple repairs that had been ignored for too long. I tightened loose hinges on kitchen cabinets, reorganized shelves in the hallway closet, and opened the windows in the afternoon to let the harbor wind move through the rooms. Each task felt like a quiet way of reclaiming the space. The house slowly began feeling like my home again, rather than the center of a conflict. Eleanor Briggs visited several times during those weeks to finish the legal paperwork connected to my finances and property. Most of those conversations happened at the kitchen table. One afternoon, after reviewing the last documents, Eleanor looked around the room and asked whether I had considered selling the house now that everything was legally secure. The question was reasonable. Property values in Charleston's historic district had continued rising, and the Harbor Street house would likely sell quickly. Still, the thought did not feel right to me. The house held too many years of my life with Thomas to become a transaction on a real estate listing. Instead of selling, another idea began forming quietly in my mind. During the weeks after the train terminal incident, I often thought about how easily my situation could have ended differently if Eleanor had not warned me to document events carefully and protect my legal rights. Not everyone has someone like that to call when trouble appears. That thought stayed with me. I eventually suggested something simple to Eleanor. Once a week, we could invite neighbors or older residents from the area to come by for coffee and conversation. If anyone had questions about property rights, financial authority, or legal documents, Eleanor could offer general guidance before problems became serious. It would not be a formal program, just a table, some coffee, and honest information. The first gathering was small. Only 3 people came that afternoon. They sat in the living room talking quietly about houses, retirement plans, and the strange ways family relationships sometimes change as people grow older. The following week, more people appeared. Word traveled quietly through the neighborhood. One afternoon, I sat near the front window while several visitors talked in the living room. The sound of calm conversation filled the house again, replacing the tension that once lived there. Listening to those voices, I realized something important. The house had not lost its purpose. It had simply found a different one. If you're still watching and want to see how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you made it this far. Because the next moment at the gate would quietly reveal the final truth about loss, consequence, and what remains after everything changes. Now let's move toward the final chapters of the story. Several months passed after the house on Harbor Street began hosting the small weekly gatherings. The routine slowly became a natural part of my life. Every Thursday afternoon, a few neighbors and older residents from nearby streets would arrive at the front porch carrying notebooks, folders, or simple questions about things they did not fully understand. Eleanor Briggs usually joined us as well, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee while quietly explaining legal details that most people had never thought to ask about before. The house felt different during those afternoons. The living room filled with conversation again, not the tense discussions that once happened there, but steady, thoughtful exchanges between people trying to understand their rights and responsibilities. Listening to those conversations often reminded me how many families face complicated situations involving money, aging, and trust. One quiet afternoon, I sat beside the front window repairing a small tear in an old jacket. The soft voices of 2 visitors drifted from the living room, where they were speaking with Eleanor about property documents. Outside, the late afternoon light rested gently across the street, and the branches of the oak trees moved slowly in the harbor wind. While lifting my eyes from the sewing, I noticed someone standing near the iron gate at the edge of the yard. At first, I thought it might be another visitor arriving early. Then the shape of the figure became clearer, and I recognized the person standing there. It was Claire. For a moment, I simply watched without moving. She stood on the sidewalk just beyond the gate, her hands resting loosely at her since the confident posture she once carried had faded. She looked thinner than I remembered, and the determined energy that used to follow her everywhere had been replaced by something quieter. Claire did not attempt to open the gate or step into the yard. Instead, she remained where she was, looking toward the house, as if trying to understand the distance between where she stood and where she once belonged. Eventually, our eyes met through the iron bars of the fence. Neither of us spoke. The moment stretched for several seconds that felt longer than they probably were. In that silence, I could see both the adult standing on the street and the child who once ran across the same yard many years earlier. I did not open the gate, but I did not turn away either. Inside the house, the calm voices of the visitors continued, discussing documents and questions about property rights. Life had moved forward within those walls, even though the past still lingered outside. After a moment, Claire lowered her eyes. She stepped back from the gate and turned slowly toward the street. Without saying a word, she began walking down Harbor Street until the distance gradually hid her from view. I watched until she disappeared around the corner. Then I lowered my eyes back to the small piece of fabric in my hands and continued sewing while the quiet conversations inside the house carried on. After Claire disappeared down Harbor Street that afternoon, the quiet outside the gate returned almost immediately. Inside the house, the gentle murmur of conversation continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Eleanor Briggs and the two visitors remained at the table discussing legal forms and the small details that many people overlook until it is too late. I sat by the window for another moment, holding the piece of fabric I had been repairing. The thread moved slowly through the cloth while the late afternoon light settled across the wooden floor. Ordinary moments like that had begun to feel important again. Months earlier, the house had been filled with tension and uncertainty. Now it had become something different. People arrived every week with questions about their homes, their savings, and the complicated situations that sometimes develop between family members when money and aging begin crossing paths. Listening to their stories reminded me how easily trust can shift without warning. What happened between Claire and me did not begin with one terrible moment. It began with smaller choices, small explanations, and the quiet belief that certain decisions would remain temporary. Standing at the train terminal, with that one-way ticket in my hand, I came very close to stepping into a future someone else had already planned for me. I often think about that ticket now. It represented a direction I was expected to follow without asking questions. Instead, I chose to remain where I was and pay attention to what felt wrong. That decision changed everything that followed. I finished sewing the jacket and folded it neatly on the table beside me. In the living room, Eleanor's calm voice continued explaining another legal document while someone asked a careful question. The house listened quietly to those conversations. Years ago, it had been the place where my daughter grew up. Now it had become a place where people learned how to protect themselves. And sometimes that is the only thing we can do when life asks us to choose between love and self-protection. Some choices in life do not arrive with loud warnings or dramatic moments. They come quietly, disguised as ordinary decisions, asking whether we will follow the path laid out for us or pause long enough to see the truth beneath it. Trust is one of the most delicate things a person can hold. It is built slowly through years of shared life, yet it can be tested in a single moment when pressure, fear, or ambition begins to overshadow compassion. In those moments, protecting one's dignity is not an act of anger, but an act of clarity. Sometimes the strongest decision is simply refusing to step into a future someone else designed. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it made you think, feel, or remember something from your own life, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, Consider subscribing and following the channel for more reflections and journeys like this one.